with the recommendation that he sort of made up his own thing, which made it very complicated. I don't know why.
The student is a Gates Scholar, which I didn't know there was such a thing.
As in,
It's in the Rhodes Scholar, except at Cambridge. It's the same thing as a Rhodes Scholar, except it's at Cambridge rather than Oxford. But it's Bill, indeed.
I'll say.
It was not as bad as
Okay. Do we do okay?
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
A friend of mine is going to come on.
So I was told, it's just like adding a new variables to a ring, polynomial.
Shooting a branch through a tree is what it is.
I was not able to make any more sense than that. I can talk.
Like, maybe I'll be this object in a model variable. And of course, it just makes all those decisions.
I see. So this is something like surreal number.
No. Yeah, and the interesting
I knew it,
thing.
you're a big fan of surreal number.
Who is?
I knew.
Why am I not surprised? I'm not surprised.
Well, I mean, not because he's a fan of surrealism, which he probably also is.
Oh, you wonder if he just likes the surreal part. Yeah. Hello, a friendly face. A friendly face. Bella visaggio.
Bella visaggio.
Visage.
Bel viso.
Bel viso.
If you start adding agio, it sounds negative. You know, in Italian, when you add people, accia,
Okay.
that becomes negative.
Bellagio Hotel, though.
It's fine.
Okay. I noticed that people here have an interesting accent in Italian, even though I don't speak Italian. I noticed that it's. So I can just use these, right? No, I have to use this.
Working now? Weird. Okay, let me fix this.
Okay.
Now, fine. This should work now, no? No, it's still there. Why is it there? Escape. Okay.
Strani fai troppi. Sai quando aggiungi?
Yeah, why does it keep?
So I just use the arrows.
Here it works. No, but I think now it should work.
I can just use the arrows. I'm going to say, okay, I'm going to make my.
Però appunto con molte indecisioni rispetto a queste terminologie tecniche e poi però un sacco di altre roba che io ho tradotto ho preso un assistente, cioè io mi leggevo da piena, se mi sembrano cose interessanti, ho preso un classicista, un latinista che gli facevo tradurre interi capitoli che poi faccio un appendice dentro dei testi tradotti. Ma il problema è che appunto anche chi lavora in queste cose, tipo per esempio Cecilia Piccoli, che è molto separata di Occo, che ha fatto questi commentari.
What? Sure.
Però manca.
It's around somewhere. Yeah.
Vabbè, poi quello che effettivamente può essere particolarmente interessante.
Okay, so it is my great pleasure to introduce for the conclusion of today, Juliet Kennedy. She got her math PhD from City University of New York. Then she's been all over as a visitor and fellow, including Stanford Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, and now she's a professor at the University of Helsinki. Since recently, she's also an external member of Sphere and she's a recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship for 2022. Sorry, I just ran up and down the stairs, so I'm trying to speak and catch my breath. I'm also excited presenting Juliet, so obviously. Among her research and teaching interests, you would not be surprised to find set theory, model theory, foundations and philosophy of mathematics, philosophy and history of logic, philosophy of language. You may be more surprised to find art history and curatorial practice. Most recently, she curated shows on artist Fred Zandback. If you're interested in what's coming next rather than the past, some of our upcoming publications are on the set theoretic content of logic in the Oxford Handbook of the Philosophy of Set Theory, a book on aesthetic and mathematics with Andrea Rana, a monograph on the syntax-semantic distinction, and a discussion of the question, what can philosophy do for set theory in the Journal of Philosophical Logic? So that's what you can look forward to. Today, she will talk about the Formalism Freeness Program, and I give you the floor to get.
Thank you, Roy. And I'm excited to be introduced by you. I'm also excited. Okay, well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very honored to receive it. And I also want to echo Karine in saying that the team here has been just incredibly hospitable and welcoming. And, sometimes you get invited to a meeting and, people are not that interested in hosting you. They just invited you because of whatever, but here you really feel wanted. And I also have to say, Sylvia, it's so nice. I was very happy when you left Princeton for Sweden, and okay, Italy is a little bit further than Sweden from Finland, but it's just wonderful that you're back in Europe and such a great addition to the European philosophy of math community. So, okay, great. All right, so I'm going to talk to you today about my program. My talk, I'll give you a brief introduction. I've written a lot about formalism independence, formalism freeness, and entanglement. I wrote a book about it, came out in 2020 during the pandemic. So what is it that Hume said when his great book came out? The book fell dead born from the press. So I think my book also being the middle of COVID, or maybe just because people didn't like the book. Anyway, it also fell dead born from the press, but it's a Cambridge University Press publication. So I'm just going to give you a few data points and a few hints of the program, try to convince you that there's something there to study. And then I'm going to sort of drill down and specialize to Tarski's work, and then looking at model theory in etymological practice post-Tarski, and then I'm going to talk about the extended constructibility paradigm, which is the implementation part, or one of the implementation. So this is a metaphor, the formal-informal border, right? The word border. There's no border between informal and formal mathematics, but I think it's a good metaphor. So it has areas of robustness, and it also displays interesting anomalies. And my program, is devoted to studying this in a systematic way as possible. So again, the extended constructibility paradigm. And the aim, or one of them, is to understand what I call the semantic point of view, and specifically the idea of semantic content. It all started because I was reading for I don't know how many times, Gödel's 1946 Princeton Bicentennial Lecture. So this was I forgot to start. All right, well, if I go a few minutes over, you will. I'll just start okay. So this was a 2 or 3 page, this 2 or 3 page paper. So Tarski, on that occasion, in 1946 at Princeton, he had a session on computability, and Gödel gave a 10-minute lecture. Which considering that Gödel was at the Institute and the meeting, I believe was at the Institute, it's a little bit odd for him to have done. But he, it's one of his most important, I think, works. So this is the first few sentences. Tarski has stressed in his lecture the great importance of the concept of general recursiveness or Turing computability. It seems to me that this importance is largely due to the fact that with this concept, one has succeeded in giving an absolute definition of an interesting epistemological notion, i.e. one not depending on the formalism chosen. So, sorry. I don't know what. Cancel. Something's happening here.
It's Starsky.
It's Tarski. Yes, it's miscalled. Okay, I'm canceling. So there are many interesting things here. So first of all, he calls a general recursiveness or computability an epistemological notion. I'll have something to say about that later. The other, and I had a very vigorous conversation with Wilfred Sieg about whether Gödel is equating here recursiveness with Turing computability, or if he means Turing computability, the Turing machine being one among other notions of computability. So I disagree there. But the main note here is this idea of formalism independence. As we know, what Gödel was talking about, the class of recursive functions are stable across a wide variety of different formalisms. There are many, many different conceptions of computability, and they're all extensionally equivalent. This gives rise to Church's thesis and so on and so forth. And this formalism independence, Gödel's afraid of the concept, was very crucial for Gödel. He had, so I wrote a paper, a couple of papers about this. There were all these questions that lingered after 1931 and the publication of the incompleteness theorem. How general were the incompleteness theorems? What is a formal system? What is a finite computation? And this kind of these kind of nagging questions, persisted until very sharply the moment Gödel gets Turing's paper in his hands, and he says, all of this is now settled. It's impossible. He made this very beautiful statement. It's impossible for anybody who ever thought about the question, that is, of giving an adequate model of human effective computability. It would be impossible for them to do anything but what Turing did. So he makes these very dramatic statements at the time and also afterward. So it was very crucial. So the formalism independence, it really was a milestone in his development and his work. He then turns to set theory with the satisfied with the knowledge that, oh, the incompleteness theorems are perfectly general. We know what a formal system is, and so. Okay, the interesting thing in this 2-page lecture is that 10-minute lecture is that he's asking that we do for provability and definability what Turing does for computability. So here's the quote. This is a continuation. The fact that this was done for computability, that is giving an unquestionably adequate, or in his word, absolute notion, we should do that for provability and definability. And these are the other two epistemological concepts. So provability, definability, and computability. Now, what unites them? Well, all of them, as he says here, in each of these, there are certain negative results, such as incompleteness. Definability is not definable in set theory. If it were definable, you get paradoxes. Take the least undefinable ordinal, you've just defined it, and so forth. But he says we should be able to do this. So this is a project in 1946. Post asked the same question earlier. I had very interesting conversations with Lisbeth de Mol, I think it's now working on. And of course, the late great Martin Diggs. Okay, so formalism freeness. So this was inspired by Gödel's expression. And it's supposed to encompass something more general. So what I think of as formalism freeness, what if you know, is the suppression of any or all aspects of a logic or a formalism except semantics. So what is a formal system? You have a signature, you have rules of proof, you have a semantics, you have all of this expressed in a logic, and then you have possibly a semantics. Now, not everybody's conception of a logic is that you have a semantics, but the suppression of logic or any of those aspects of a formal. So it's a kind of big portmanteau term. It's a graded notion. It's not necessarily a yes or no affair. So I want to include under its banner not only the discussion around computability, but in addition, concepts that are stable with respect to syntactic variation generally. Okay, now a very important distinction to make is between vocabulary, thought of as a set of primitive terms of a mathematical area, such as group theory, and vocabulary or signature, we use the word signature, regarded as a constituent of a formal language. So we have a theory of groups. Groups come with a binary operation and an identity element. And so that I would think of as vocabulary. This is not a syntax, right? This is a vocabulary. So that's a very important distinction to draw. Mathematics is, of course, full of this. In its original natural language mode, it's impervious to details of logic and syntax that are essential in the framing of a foundational formal system. So whether the formalism is first or higher order, or whether you allow function symbols along with relations, and so on. For example, the completeness axiom for the reals is a second order axiom, while the other axioms are the reals are first order, but the working analyst probably doesn't even know or care. Speaking of the reals, it's remarkable how impervious the practice is to the set theoretic definition of the reals. John Burgess calls this phenomenon indifferentism. So he defines this as the general phenomenon of the indifference of working mathematicians to certain kinds of decisions that have to be made in any codification of mathematics. Two analysts who wish to collaborate do not need to check whether they were taught the same definition of real number. Translation hiding in plain sight, as Emily Alker calls indifference. She is in the comparative literature department at NYU, and she wrote a book called Against World Literature, the Politics of Translation. Very interesting. But anyway, she loved this concept of indifference. All right, Kreisel, in his paper Informal Rigor and Completeness Proofs, the mathematician never gives a second thought to the form of the predicate used in the comprehension axiom. This is why Bourbaki is extremely careful to isolate the assumptions of the theorem, but never the axioms of set theory implicit in the deduction. For example, what instances of the comprehension axiom are used. Now, there are foundational issues having to do with axiom of choice or the idea of an arbitrary set of reals and so on. But that's a different set of issues. I'm talking about this idea of indifferentism. Formalism, freeness, and logical and set theoretical practice is also interesting. That's my main interest these days, I would say. So looking at set theory just on a basic level, the work in set theorists is indifferent to the syntactic form of canonical objects of study like the ordered pair. So we use Kuratowski notation, but what's at issue is the idea that concepts in set theory are defined uniquely and not up to isomorphism. Once the set theorist realizes this can be done, the formalism is ignored. So another way to say this, the set theoretic definition of such basic concepts is usually absolute. And here I'm using the word absolute in a different way, possibly than the way Gödel used it in the quote I read to you. This just means delta one in the language of the theory, or if you like, independent of the background set theory. So it doesn't matter what model of set theory you're in. These basic notions are rigid. Okay, the other side of the coin, entanglement. So logical moves, such as the ascent from first to higher order logic, or from a relational to a functional language. So language is relational if it has relation symbols in it. Functional language has function symbols. So this move often has a substantial effect in the environment and are, of course, very significant to the logician. So one example of this is Fagan's theorem. So the 0-1 law for finite relational structures says that the probability that a random relational structure on that domain satisfies a given first order formula tends asymptotically to either 0 or 1 as the size of the models increases. But if we allow function symbols as part of the language, even the simple sentence exists X, that a function has a fixed point, has a limit probability that it's not 0 or 1 over E. So it's an odd situation. I mean, even as every logician knows, the function symbols are certainly definable from the relation symbols, but nonetheless, there's this exquisite sort of sensitivity to whether we actually throw them into the language. Now, there are many examples, the Bernay, Schoenfinkel, Ramsey class. There's the definition is decidable if we don't have function symbols in the language, which proves that if we have function symbols, there's a massive failure of decidability, even just a universal theory. Yes, okay, 1976. Piano arithmetic, first order piano is non-categorical in the worst possible way, having as many non-isomorphic countable models as it possibly can, or second order piano is categorical. Of course, both theories are what's called nowadays internally categorical. Now, I want to stress that to the logician, and I'm a very proud logician, I'm not saying this is nothing. I'm saying these are moves that the practice is not attending to. The analyst, right, well, Michael can tell us, did you ever walk into a classroom and say, today only first order modification, or today no function symbols, or maybe, this is make it more complicated, I think. Okay, so what I want to say is, as a logician, to me, there's something wrong here. There's what I would say a breakdown in the adequacy of our formalizations, or like certain misalignments being exposed. We're trying to capture these intuitive concepts, so we don't want this hypersensitivity of language. I mean, the change from a relational to a functional language shouldn't make a difference. It's logical analysis shows us that it does. Note that any formalism already fails to capture the character of natural language discourse. Ordinary mathematical discourse is a mixture of logical idioms, right? There are uncountably many, there are infinitely many. For all functions from the reals to the reals and so on. So you have this boiling soup of logical idioms, right? So any formalism is going to have to make a decision, commit to a choice of quantification of a particular order, or committing to a choice of particular signatures. So just on the level of surface grammar, it's going to fail to capture the practice. Let's see what philosophers have to say. Of course, Wittgenstein, one might be led by this to suspend, this is not a quote from Wittgenstein, this is me, to suspend the foundational attitude. So this is the idea that Wittgenstein was so critical of in his later writings, that at the deepest level of language, there's an underlying logical structure which runs through our thought and language. I'm quoting Flora Diamond from a lecture in 2009. Or as Sandra Logier puts it, the idea that we always think or speak within a theory, an informal theory. So this is the position. But the position sets itself against. Strawson, natural language, ordinary language has no exact logic. Michael Glansberg. So I think he would take, well, he does take the view in logical consequence of natural language that you shouldn't conceive of natural language and its logical aspects as a kind of thinly disguised formal language, a matter of cleaning up the relevant definitions, concepts, and so on. For Glansberg, natural language and formal discourse are, at least with respect to their logical scaffolding, and maybe the word scaffolding would be controversial for Glansberg, two autonomous domains, though the processes of identification, abstraction, and idealization can forge some connections between them. Now, the paper, he's using logic in a non-standard way. It's mostly a critique of moral theoretic semantics, that we don't have this enough. Okay, here's from 6 days ago from Michael's blog, the entry called Mathematical AI's Immaculate Conception. Michael always has wonderful titles on his posting. So he's quoting McClarty as saying, intuitions have specific objective meaning, which formalized theories lack. And Michael says, there's no easy way to make sense of this sentence, which McClarty extracts from his reading of Poincaré, but with which he clearly sympathizes. The difficulty of characterizing with specificity and objectivity, of pinning down meaning in the setting of mathematics, helps explain why philosophers less sensitive than McClarty to mathematical practice, so no one here, of course, are tempted to take refuge in formalized theories, which are themselves amenable to formal analysis, but which reduce mathematics to little more than Diderot's dystopian fantasy. So I'll let you read Michael's blog to see what Diderot's dystopian fantasy is. Okay, so as a logician, I take all of this very seriously. I don't want to suspend the foundational attitude. Logical analysis has its place. In fact, logical analysis is a glorious thing. And I hope to prove that to you. Okay, so how are we going to stay on solid ground? I mean, I just temperamentally, I like this expression, philosophical humility. I mean, for me, how can we possibly stay on solid ground by making these kind of strong declarative statements? How do we know whether we think within the theory? How can we possibly know something like that? But we can stay on solid ground by looking at the history and by formulating strategies within the semantic point of view that sort of test for robustness. So there's things we can do logically and mathematically. So that was my introduction, very brief. As I said, I wrote a whole book about this. So I want to talk now about Tarski's conceptualization of the mathematical. So this was a phrase, kind of magic phrase in Tarski. It would shape model theory from its emergence in the algebraic school in the 19th century to its reemergence in the work of present day model theorists such as Shala and Silber, work that prioritizes the suppression of syntax and logic in one form or another and the forefronting of semantic concepts. Here's it from Uriah Sinazura. So she's, this is her paper, Tarski's Practice in Philosophy. So she encapsulates Tarski's view with this quote, the semantic view that truth is not just proof and meaning not just language. So again, it's part of this, putting Tarski in this area of, adopting what I'm calling the semantic point of view, critique of language. Okay, so Tarski himself has owned to working under the obvious influence of the algebraic tradition in logic, and there's many people have written about this, associated with figures like Schroeder and Peirce. Others have pointed to the influence of the successful in Tarski's view, so he actually speaks highly of this conceptual analysis of intuitive geometric notions coming out of mainstream mathematics in Poland over time. So the mathematical is a phrase that's all over the place in Tarski, but it's unanalyzed. Not unlike the status of Tarski, the semantical. There may be some Tarski specialists will disagree with me on that. But if you compare it, for example, to logicality, right? He gave that beautiful address in the 60s, which was published posthumously. He thought a lot about logicality. I think it's called What is a Logical Constant, and so on. So obviously he's thinking about semantic consequence, and he needs to understand the status of logical constant. Okay, now the meaning of the mathematical comes through in the theorems. So I think the analysis of the mathematical is actually comes through in the theorems. It's sort of part of their philosophy. So let's look at one of his earliest papers, if not his early undefinable sets of real numbers. So here is a quote from that paper. Mathematicians do not like to deal with the notion of definability. In this article, I shall try to convince the reader that this is not correct. The notion of definability as usually conceived of is of a metamathematical origin. I believe that I have found a general method which allows us to construct a rigorous metamathematical definition of this notion. Now, definability is something that's come up. I think it's very interesting, Fenner's project, when, for example, people are using the axiom of choice, and when they're doing something that's completely definable. So by definable, I just mean, for example, we have arithmetic, we have a plus in the signature, plus times successor, and so forth. You can define what it means for an element of a model of arithmetic to be prime. So you can say all that. You have first order quantifications, you have multiplication. So if number is prime, if two numbers, if it's a product of two numbers, then the first one is 1 and the second one is the number, or vice versa. So this is definability, right? What you can say. Okay, so he goes on, he says, it's possible to replace this notion, this signature-dependent notion of definability, by a definition formulated exclusively in mathematical terms. Now, this is not definability in general, which is paradoxical. This is definability for the first-order theory of real closed field. Under this new definition, the notion of definability does not differ from other mathematical notions and need not arouse either fears or doubts. It could be discussed entirely with the domain of normal mathematical reasoning. But what he's doing is he's starting to normalize metamathematics for the mathematician. Right? He's using this word normal a lot. So here's the theorem. Set of reals is definable in the first order theory of real closed fields if and only if it's a union of a finite number of intervals with rational endpoints. And this, of course, is the general notion now is minimality. So people who are working in philosophy of model theory know all about minimality. So there's a definable set of reals for you. So you have a metamathematical concept being replaced by something as concrete and mathematical as could be. Here's an excerpt from Flott in 1986. Commenting on Tarski's 1950 ICM lecture. An additional feature is that in the whole presentation, Tarski manages to find notions like EC class without any mention of a formalized language. What is an EC class? Which is first order definability with equality. Tarski liked the idea of replacing a metamathematical definition by a mathematical one, and was even more pleased by a very mathematical one, such as Birkhoff's definition of equational class. Later on, he liked the purely mathematical definition of elementary equivalence structures by Price-Sig. These very suggestive, intuitive ideas may be without a precise content, as a precise distinction between mathematical and metamathematical might well be considered to be impossible because of Tarski's definition of truth. Of course, it is only in proofs that mathematicians must be precise. In the important matter of selecting what to think about, anything goes. I think that's a beautiful statement. So just so you know what Flott is referring to. So here, Birkhoff, a class of structures is an equational class if and only if it's closed under these nice properties, self-algebra direct product and homomorphic images. And then there's the very famous characterization, Kiesler and Shala, of elementary equivalence. So two structures of the same vocabulary or signature satisfy the same sentences, if and only if they have isomorphical components. So if you look at that isomorphism, there's no syntax, right? The language just goes poof, just disappears. In his 1950 paper, The Borderline of Algebra and Mathematics, Tarski equates metamathematical with syntactical, so he does let himself be drawn into, people must have pressed him, he does let himself be drawn into defining what he means. The mathematical, so this is an autonomous domain, seemingly beyond critique. It's takes place in natural language with informal set theory in the background, very important point there. And it's kind of a reversal of logicism. So rather than reduce mathematics to logic, Tarski wants to change the direction of the arrow and pull the metamathematical into the mathematical. And it's slightly heretical for the logician, right? We think the metamathematics clarifies rather than obfuscates. So what's going on with Tarski? What does he really think? So here's Beckerman, sorry, I don't have the reference, but it's in my book. It's all public relations. He wanted to make clear to mathematicians that these metamathematical results were part of mathematics. And very interesting, Beckerman equates precise mathematical with general set theoretical terms. So that's an interesting thing from Beckerman. Or is there a principled view, the view that the actual content of mathematics goes beyond any formalization? So Colin McCarthy refers to this as expansion intuitionism, his term for Poincaré's reaction, or counter-reaction to formalism. So here from Colin's paper, for Poincaré, formal proof never itself yields knowledge, neither for the inventor nor for the student. Mathematical knowledge comes from mathematical reasoning, which is contentual and not formal. Okay, let me check my time. Okay. All right, so I want to look at Tarski's characterization of the EC classes or first order logic in detail. We won't go through all of the mathematics, but I just want to show you what this looks like, and probably many of you have seen this already. So this, I believe, is from the Borderline paper. Again, the notion of an arithmetical class is of metamathematical origin. Whether or not a set of algebraic systems is an arithmetical class depends on the form in which it's expressed. However, it's proved to be possible to characterize this notion in purely, here we go again, purely mathematical terms, and to discuss it by means of normal mathematical method. So, as I say, an arithmetical class is a class of structures definable in first order logic with equality. This is what he refers to as an EC class. So he says the theory of arithmetical classes has thus become a mathematical theory in the usual sense, and it can be regarded as a chapter of universal algebra. And I think, I mean, I'm looking at this again, and also being at this meeting, and I think also Fenner's talk this morning, the way this language, and Sylvia's talking about, the way the way language is used in the presentation of mathematics, it does encourage a kind of shared mathematical culture and a shared, a very strong consensus on what mathematics is, right? All of this is sort of nudging the community toward a certain set of standards and milestones and so on. So Tarski is drawing on this very powerful shared consensus of what mathematics is. So I'll just take you through it quickly. It's on the slides for anybody who wants to go through it in detail. So a model class, so this is the basic notion. It's a class of structures, that is to say models of the same vocabulary, closed under isomorphism. That's all it is. for example, the class of all groups. That's a model class. A model class family is a class of classes. So it's an index collection consisting of model classes. And there's no, as long as the indexing set is a set, there's no problem in set theory talking about classes and classes and classes. Sure. Now, we can identify a logic with a model class family. The model classes that are elements of, calling it BL star, are we just simply take the classes mod phi of models of sentences of the logic. Okay, so let's gather together all those model classes. We have a logic, we have sentences of the logic. Let's gather together all the model classes. We have a canonical mapping of sentences of the logic to their model class. And this I think of as the essence of the semantic point of view. So this is the semantic point of view. We think of sentences of a logic as model classes. Okay. Model class families avoid all the noise, details that don't add anything to meaning. As we all know, first order logic, it can be done with this collection of propositional connectives or that, negation and disjunction or disjunction and negation and conjunction and implication and so forth and so on. Okay, but that's all noise. Okay, now it's an easy exercise to see that the intersection, union, and complement of a model class is again a model class. So let's ask, when is a model class family a Boolean algebra? Well, this happens especially when the model class family is the model class family of a logic. And it will reflect the syntax of the logic via this mapping, where L star here is logic which is closed on conjunction, disjunction, and negation. So we can read the logical operations, we can read them off the operations of the Boolean algebra. Okay, so we have a model class family, and we know it's a model class family associated to a logic, but we don't know anything about the logic. If we know it's a Boolean algebra, that will suggest that our logic is closed under conjunction, disjunction, and negation. Not all logics are, of course, and that these operations have a classical sense. Okay, so pondering the closure properties of model classes, we're able to see the logic in the background. So I got this paper, I got this picture, and I thought, well, the model classes are the curtains, and the landscape is the logic. So are the model classes a sort of insubstantial thing? But actually not. I mean, this is what we see. I mean, this is a semantic point of view, that what you have in front of you are the model classes. Everything else is kind of blurry. That's the semantic point of view, maybe. You want to be ideological about it. Okay, I just want to make an aside. Logics with negation. So a logic has negation in the semantic sense if given a sentence of the logic and considering its model class, take the complement of the model class inside the class of structures without signature. If we can find a sentence in the same signature so that that model class is the class of models of that sentence. So we find a sentence phi prime, so that K prime is mod phi prime. We say that the logic has negation. Now, not all logics have negation. If the logic had negation in its syntax, and the negation had the classical meaning, then we could simply let phi prime be negation phi. But it may not have negation in its syntax. So this was a very famous question in the case of fixed point logic of finite structures. A very famous result of Immerman that in fact fixed point logic does have negation in the semantic sense, though it doesn't have negation as part of its syntax. So from the model class point of view, we are picking up syntactic information. We're seeing the syntax when it's not even in the signature. So this is what I think, a glorious thing, right? logician. I think it's an absolutely astonishing and beautiful result. And by the way, fixed point logic is no ad hoc creation. It is this captures the complexity class in this P time. Okay, very important logic. Okay, so we're on the way to characterizing first order logic semantically. Tarski introduces this concept of a cylindric algebra. I would get a headache when I read what is a cylindric algebra. So let's forget that. There's a definition. Better. So you want to say, you want to be able to rename your logical constants. So it's all here. So we have permutations, which are essentially renaming. We want our logic to be closed under that. We want a notion of sublogic. That's all this free expansion business is. And we want projections. So this is how semantically you think of as existential quantification in terms of projection. So what Tarski essentially did was he showed that the model class family corresponding to first order logic is the minimal model class family that, so this is technical, kind of having atomic formulas, it's a Boolean algebra, and it's closed under projections, permutations, and free expansion. Okay, this all has a category theoretic flavor, doesn't it? So here's a quote from Barwise. There are certain syntactic transformations of sentences that seem inherent in the idea of a logic. He talks about renaming, he talks about relativization. We must find a way of building such syntactic transformations into the definition of a logic if we are to have a reasonably smooth theory. Simple way of making all of this turn out smoothly is to use the notion of flunk category theory. So he does this. Nobody really picks up on it, but I think nowadays there's a literature now on things like interpretation. So the category Barwise's category, I'm sure nobody's citing this paper, has, so the objects are the languages and the morphisms are the interpretations. So it's a natural thing to do. Okay, so this is a kind of outside perspective on a logic. Moskowski's definition of an abstract logic taken up by Lindstrom also has a category theoretic flavor. I'm talking with a student in Paris who wants a categorical analysis of computability. And we're having, for many months now, a long drawn out conversation, but I'm thinking that this outside perspective kind of misses the texture of computability, and he disagrees, but I think computability is one thing that very much resists being analyzed categorically. Anyway, here's the outside perspective I like very much, this Moskowski's definition. Okay, so that's what Tarski did, and he talked a lot about it, and we have all those papers, and we have people like Vaught reporting on it, and many others. So Tarski proves that a first order logic is the minimal logic with those closure properties, but are there other logics that have, how did he hit first order logic, hit the nail on the head, so to speak. So here we want to say a model class family has a downward, so here's a semantic version of the downward loan and so on theorem. Every model class which contains an infinite model, like a countable model. Here's the semantic version of the compactness property. Every subfamily with non-empty finite intersections has non-empty intersection. So Lindstrom proved, so he improves on Tarski by saying that if you add downward Longhans-Golem and compactness, you hit first order logic exactly. So whatever the syntax of your logic is, if you satisfy those mathematical conditions using Tarski's language, you are looking at a model class family corresponding to first order logic. Okay, so again, Tarski's theorem says this is the minimal family, Lindstrom says it's the maximum section. Okay, And so beautiful talk by Davide yesterday. It was a wonderful session. Also, Gabriel even talked on dividing lines. Really, yeah, really, I was very happy listening to those two talks. It was wonderful. So this is kind of continuation of their talk about Lowenheim's Soul and oh, is it 6 o'clock?
They have 15 minutes.
Okay, so now, if you think about what Tarski did, you simply notice that first order logic has those closure properties. You can look at it. Lindstrom's theorem is actually, it's quite a beautiful theorem, and Davide, it's quite a beautiful, maybe you've seen the proof, but it's a beautiful application of compactness, non-standard models. You have overspill and so on. It's very beautiful theorem. Okay, or-wise, so we have the semantic point of view. Of course, the proof theorists, you know, they get very mad when they talk to me. They think everything is syntax, right? There isn't even any such thing as semantic. It's all syntax. Or-wise is kind of in the middle. So here's a quote from a paper of his. Lindstrom avoids syntactic considerations altogether since he deals directly with classes of structures rather than with the sentences that define them. So this is, again, the semantic point of view. You don't think of sentences, you think of the model class. We find this unsatisfactory, contrary to the very spirit of model theory, where the primary object of study is the relationship between syntax and semantics. It fails to make explicit that the closure conditions on the classes of structures arise out of natural syntactic considerations which seem implicit in the very idea of model theoretic vocabulary. So Borwise is a very interesting figure in all this. The semantic reformulations of metamathematics goes roaring on. So here's Bill Craig's theorem, interpolation for first order logic. So if we have phi 1, phi 1 implies phi 2. That should be phi 2, that's a typo there. Then there's a first order sentence and interpolant in the common vocabulary such that phi 1 implies psi, and psi implies phi 2. So this is actually a fascinating theorem. Well, they all are. But I asked Craig one time, why did they prove that theorem? And maybe Paolo, you and I can talk about this a little more. You probably know a lot more than I do about this. But he said it had to do with this whole effort to find a physicalistic language for science. So they wanted to separate theoretical terms from the empirical terms. And this was a long time ago. I was a lot younger, but I really wish I pressed him on this. But Paolo, probably you talked with him. Paolo has a beautiful paper on this. What is it? Conversations between Quine, Tarski, and Carnap at Harvard in 1941. Yeah, so this is this period when Tarski was and Quine and Carnap were trying to work out a physicalistic language for science. So that's where this theorem comes out of. Here's a semantic version. Any two disjoint PC classes can be separated by the PC class. So this goes on, this kind of semantic point of view. Logic's given by a game. We play a 2-person game. You have 2 structures. Player 1 picks a structure, an element of a structure. Player 2 picks a corresponding element, and so on it goes. After n rounds, we've constructed n pairs. If this is a partial isomorphism, we say player 2 is 1. What is first order logic? So a logic, is first order if player 2 has a winning strategy in this game for every n, for games and everything. Okay. Games like that exist for most. No logics, some of them for most. Shala has, so this is another grist for my mill, very important logic. It's the only logic, I believe, except for first order, which has interpolation. L1 kappa, he calls it. There's no formula, there's no syntax, there's just a game. In other words, there's a criterion of elementary equivalence given by the equivalence relation associated to the game. And this is Shalaw's program. So Davide and I were talking yesterday after his talk. I mean, you have this Lindstrom characterization of first order logic, but then you want to ask about stronger logics, whether they have some degree of compactness or Lowenheim theorems. And it's a huge project of Shalaw and also us in Helsinki to get Lindstrom theorems, as I showed. Okay, contemporary model theory. This goes on. I think I will go, yeah, I will go quickly through this, but yeah, Shell introduces a notion of an abstract elementary class. So instead of an elementary class, he introduces an abstract submodel relation and gets rid of any kind of syntax or notion of formula because he wants to prove categoricity theorems. And I have a nice quote from him. So here's Kieker describing the AACs. There's no syntax. Thank you. So here is Shalaw in an email to me describing the thesis of his classification theory for AECs. So Gabriel, this is for you. He says, considering classical model theory as a tower, the lower floors disappear, the higher floors do not have formulas or anything syntactical at all. So this disappearance of syntax that Tarski was so fond of, this is a major, major powerful strain in contemporary model theory. Okay, and I had some slides on even more contemporary work, but I'll just leave it as that. So I just want to end with a few words about set theory. So I use this word implementation in my talk. So implementing Gödel's 1946 Princeton bicentennial lecture. So what he's saying is that he's praising computability because you have all these conceptually distinct formalizations of the notion, which give rise to the same class of functions. They're extensionally equivalent. So how would you implement that for the notion of definability? So I didn't want to touch provability. Being model theorists and people working on inflection principles and all that are very good at this program, but thinking about undefinability. So here's a kind of strategy that fell out of that. And again, I showed you this already. This is Gödel calling for us to do what Turing did for computability, for provability and definability. So I think the way I interpreted what Gödel was asking for, he's asking how sensitive to its underlying logic is a given canonical mathematical object, right? So we've talked a lot, there's a lot of syntactic sensitivity all over the place in logical practice, but we can ask, we take our favorite canonical mathematical object, when you formalize it, it's built over some logic, for usually first order. What happens if we change the underlying logic to another logic or a whole class of other logic? What happens? Do we get a change in the structure, or does the structure sit right where it is? Does it stay the same? So that's the strategy, that's the implementation. So we do this with Gödel's L. This was from the 1946 lecture. So Gödel's constructible hierarchy, he invents it to prove the consistency of the generalized continuum hypothesis. It's the smallest transitive model of CFC. There are two ways of presenting it. You can take all the ordinals and then close under some very elementary functions, or you can go from define it by transfinite recursion in stages. So at successor stages, you add sets which are definable with parameters from the previous level. So it's a very tight controlled object, and it's a miracle that it still satisfies the axioms of ZFC, and it satisfies the continuum hypothesis and even the GCH. It's so tightly constructed, maybe it's not surprising that you don't have a lot of reals in in a constructible hierarchy. If allophone wheels. And the smallest amount you possibly have consistently. So we want to test to see if this object is necessarily or intrinsically a first order object. And we do what I just said before, we substitute for the first order logic. Your favorite other logics, the logics that Mostowski invented, generalized quantifiers, and so on. And it turns out there's a huge, huge robustness there. So you can substitute all of those quantifiers and more cardinality quantifiers. So Q alpha, they're Q1, they're at least alpha1 many, and so on, all of these. So it's very, very robust object. So the idea is to stop thinking of your favorite canonical objects in mathematics as first order structures, or maybe they are, you carry out this test. Okay, there are some precedents of this, which I didn't know. Pod, the hereditarily ordinal definable sets, this is second order L, and then Chang used these infinitary logics. We found some intermediate models that were very interesting. This project has been going on since 2009, but we should have some decent theorems. The inner models that we have found satisfy some of them satisfy GCH, have some large cardinals in them, and are forcing generically absolute or forcing robust. So I just want to switch a little. The inner model program, it's this, we want to build canonical L-like models of set theory, but containing larger infinities. These are very, very, very complicated constructions. And these extender models, and it's an elaboration of iterated ultrapowers and so on. And it turns out that some of the extender models live inside of our models. So this is a recent development. So we have a kind of merging, and even some of our models might be extender models. So we were very, very lucky there. Here's our team, a square group. We showed up at AIM, which funds you 4 people to do research, and we showed up as 10 people. They were very cross with us. So you can carry out this strategy of changing the underlying logic with any canonical object, for example, the Kleene ramified hierarchy. Any kind of hierarchy can change the logic and you test for robustness. So that's the kind of implementation that that I have in mind. So so this was an attempt, as I said, to stay on solid ground, try to flesh out the semantic point of view in its origins in model theoretic and logical practice and how it manifests today. The syntax or logic-free approach is a very, very significant part of logical practice. Logical analysis provides us with tools to understand syntax freeness more fully. And it helps us in the end to situate the mathematical within logical space. Okay, thank you very much. Been very patient.
So thank you very much, and the floor is open for questions. Yes. How do I open this? Who can help me with this? No, but it's not on. I don't know how to turn it on.
No, that one is without battery.
Okay, I am fascinated by this because it's in the same talk, there is a lot of things that are sympathetic and a lot of things that are antipathetic. So that's really quite strange. So I try to explain.
We have sympathy and we have antipathy.
Exactly, in the same time, in a very great level.
And who would expect otherwise, Marco, from you?
Level. So let's start with the sympathy. I think that this idea that there is something that is to be stable under formalization is not only a nice idea, but I think that it is in some sense the essence even of mathematics.
It's the one?
The science of mathematics, mathematics is still something that is to be stable, and if we are not able to grasp it, we are not speaking about mathematics and end of the story. We're speaking of formulas, we're speaking of languages, but we are not speaking of mathematics. So the fact that that is an absolutely central question for philosophy of mathematics, I could not agree more. On the other side, it seems to me that the idea is something that I think strange, the grasp of this content going in the other way around than in the way in which we go. It is for the formal, it's to the informal, rather than from the formal to the formal. So in some sense, the idea seems to see that what the way to grasp this content is a model theoretic approach, and so the formal will disappear because if the model theoretic approach in some sense is able to deny it.
So why do you call it model theoretic approach?
The model theoretic approach is, what is the content in this point of view? The content of mathematics is given by the class of model of
that's
so okay. And, there is something that I not best, but I intellectually detest is the idea that a mathematical object is a model theoretic entity. It seems to me that much more genuine attitude consists in saying that when we formalize, we try to grasp in different way some informal content that is there before, not after the formalization. So this is not to criticize you, simply to make it clear why I found behind that in the same time a terribly fundamental, absolutely fundamental problem. And on the other side, a point of view that is certainly legitimate, but it seems to me that could be opposed to another point of view that is the one that I prefer.
Yeah, so I don't think of it as a model theoretic. I think of it as a semantic point of view. So we put ourselves in natural language. We take a canonical object like the reals, and then we say, all right, let's look at the various formalizations. How do the reals change under the change of those formalization? So I think we are starting at a previously given semantic framework, which is there. The logic is a kind of way of testing the adequacy of our form, of testing sensitivity to signature, testing for robustness.
That's scientific way. I learned what the real number are when I learned what the real number are when I was students in first year of analysis. I didn't know nothing about semantic, nothing about the logic, but I perfectly understood what are real numbers. So I don't think that in order to fix the notion of real number, or natural number isn't clear. I learned what natural number are before knowing anything of that. So it seems to me that this is a way to grasp something that's there before, and it's for a very long time before even the idea of the formal logic appeared in sort of human.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I'm not sure we have any disagreements, actually.
okay, it's what I mean. Only sympathetic.
Thank you. I was wondering about the following. You will remember the book from like 40 years ago, edited by Pfefferman Bauweiss on model theoretic logics. And in the introduction, Bauweiss sketched a completely different program, namely not ignoring logics, but basically to custom build them to study specific mathematical objects. So in hindsight, from your point of view, has this program failed? Does it have to be replaced what you are trying to do? Or how do you relate the two programs? I mean, one is about like custom building logics to study mathematical objects, and the other one, what you have characterized, basically making the logic disappear as much as possible. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is, I'm sure it's my fault, but as a lover of logic, a proud logician, I call myself a logician before I call myself anything else. I think it's a way, so no, I think we devise logics every day in order to try to understand better, you know, husband is working on the concept of dependence logic. It's very interesting logic. It's a fragment of second order logic and it has very interesting properties related to intuitionistic logic and so on. So I think that's a very honorable and great practice, and that's the standard practice. What I'm trying to do is something different. Just work on the semantic side. I'm not trying to make the logic disappear, but there is a certain sympathy toward this Wittgenstein, Logier, Glansberg point of view that we shouldn't just assume by carrying out Barwise's program that we are thinking within that logic, that there's vagueness at the boundary, there's failure of adequacy all over the place. And we have to pay attention to that, and we have to look at that and see. I mean, the basic intuition is, you know, there's even a book, Alex Picasso, very nice book called The One True Logic. So, you know, they don't offer the one true logic. They criticize the idea that they criticize pluralism. But I think what I'm trying to do is get a better understanding of the limitations of our logics and a better understanding. I'm just flat out fascinated by this move and of characterizing metamathematics in semantic terms, and what does it mean and why are we doing it, and is it because we want to join the math club, or is it something else? Is there a philosophical, you know, grounding to the whole thing? So I'm just fascinated by it, and I think, you know, I'm very, as I say, I like this phrase philosophical humility, so I would never say natural language has no logic or anything like that. But I think there are things we can do to stay on solid ground, things we can do mathematically and logically. And that's what I want. That's what I want to do. So I'm very extremely reticent philosophically, and that's why I love being at this meeting. I think I heard the word metaphysics a few times, but not that all. So.
Thank you very much for an inspiring talk. I just wanted to ask if you think the following might be of any interest as a distinctive phenomenon. So I don't know if it fits well within this account, but I was thinking of results in model theory, like an old theorem of McIntyre and others, to the effect that every infinite field with quantifier elimination is an algebraically closed field, where it seems to me, I don't know if that is helpful here, but that between cases where we have really non-robust features like quantifier elimination that critically depend on the choice of signature, and cases where we have stability, we might perhaps locate cases where only locally for some signatures, the model theoretic property transposes into something that is just then independently qualifiable mathematically. That's
yeah, and I think people are doing that. You know, there's a lot of work there on this classification and so on. I think I just had a thought responding to you, if it's okay. I enjoyed your talk yesterday so much, and I hope we can talk some more. But I was thinking, so what are you doing with these logics? What is Barwise and Mostowski? So the mathematician uses a quantifier. There are infinitely many, or there are uncountably many. Well, if you take the quantifier, there are infinitely many, out of the first order logic, you think about its model theoretic properties. As you know, David, it's not, you don't have compactness. If you add the quantifier Q1, there are uncountably many, suddenly the logic is compact. So I would call that, so what you have, the more metaphysical commitment you have, or metaphysical entanglement, this is a phrase of Gil-Sagi, right? The more metaphysically heavy the quantifier is, it's not necessarily the case that these nice model theoretic properties line up, right? So they don't track metaphysical heaviness. You get very nice properties, model theoretic properties high up, you get bad ones very low down. So I guess I think that's something to think about, something to try to understand, right? And as I said, in terms of mathematical practice, in terms of this meeting, this idea that the mathematician is freely using every single day this huge mixture of logical idioms. There are uncountably many, there are infinitely many, there are functions, passive polynomial functions from the real to the real. And it makes no difference in, I would guess, no theorem is going to fail because the person didn't realize they were using second order quantification. So this is a feature of the practice that we have to think about. Well, why is this happening? We're logicians. We've been at it for 150 years now. When was Frege, right? Almost 200 years. We've been at this for a long time. And yet, we don't understand why the practice is sort of floating above the foundations in the way that it does. At least it's something I would like to understand. So whatever you think, Marco, of this, use of logic or disappearance of logic, we have to track very closely when logic disappears, think about what it means, and try to understand it, and then try to, so that's the project. That's how I see my job.
Thank you, Juliette. So if I understood correctly, we like formulas and feelers, we dislike entanglement. I'll see you there. Closer to like this. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. This, okay. Then I speak like this.
I'll move over here so I can see you.
Yeah, I felt.
Okay.
Right. So we like formulas and feelers. We dislike the entanglement bit. And I was wondering, so what happens when you find cases of entanglement? I guess there are two questions. One is, when do they arise? Do you know something general about when this arises? And then is the project to tidy this up? And what makes you think that this can be tidied up?
I think the project is not, if you look at the 0-1 laws for finite structures, it's weird because it's a theorem that holds for the relational languages, and functions are definable from relation. They're even definable. But as soon as you throw it into the syntax, the theorem fails. So I guess I'm just sort of gobsmacked by that. And I think there are all kinds of 0-1 laws. I haven't looked recently, but there are miles and miles of 0-1 laws out there, and I'm sure they don't all have the same sensitivity to syntax. But the idea isn't to try to, and this isn't to try to clean the thing up, but just try to contemplate philosophically, what is the meaning of it, and just kind of recognize the world that we're living in. It's a world, where the mathematician isn't making those distinctions. We are, and in fact, what we're doing. I don't know, maybe Fagin's theorem, and by the way, it was very bad. I didn't have time to look up. A Russian mathematician found it also. It's a very typical thing that happens, I think. But so I think it's, if you look at Balthasar Graupmeyer's work, very interesting young logician, that the second incompleteness theorem, there's a lot of literature on this, starting with Pfefferman and also Curtis Franks has written about this, that it depends on even not only the coding, right? Whether or not you use infix notation. What is infix notation? Parentheses, right? So to change to another notation, suddenly you can't prove a second incompleteness theorem anymore. So there's all kinds of sensitivity out there. So I don't see myself as some sort of policewoman going out there and saying this is, but I just want to say we have to be aware of this, and I've incorporated it very strongly into my own logical practice. And I think these anomalies are very interesting. And I think you know, and I wrote a rejoin, I was invited to a special issue on the one Alex Pastel, and he has a co-author that unfortunately I forget the co-author's name, but, you know, provided we're doing it, and of course I said, this is nuts. You know, how can you even call a book with the one true logic? I think it was deliberately provocative, but I think that's the idea. We want to take context sensitivity seriously. A lot of people have said that. So, I should say though, I mean, I don't want to make a fetish out of it. I'd rather just prove the theorems, you know. I think in category theory, they pay a lot of attention to the foundational aspect and the formalization and so on. Set theorists are not so interested in the foundational. You define things any way you like, and then you go on and think about combinatorics and forcing axioms and so on. So I think people are critical of set theory because they don't like the way things are formalized under the standard, in the standard text, but set theorists actually don't care about that. So there's the formalism freeness of mathematics is sort of deeply entrenched in set theoretic practice also. Yeah, or indifferentism, whatever you like.
Thank you. It's great to see you present that work because I've read the paper that started this all, and it was great to hear you talk about this. So one thing that I thought when I first read the paper, and I thought again today, is specifically in the context of contemporary model theory, it seems there are a lot of notions, some of which you point out, or theorems which span this syntax semantics distinction that allow you to bridge from one to the other. But I wonder if it's if the excitement that model theorists have for finding semantic versions of syntactic phenomena also goes the other way as well. Like the excitement is more about the bridging, if I can go back and forth between syntax and semantics, more than just sort of the one direction from a semantic notion or theorem to a syntactic one.
So I think it's by no means, what is it, heterogeneous, they're not a unified, I always forget what those words mean. They're not a unified, so there are some people who will put a toothpick under their fingernails before they will mention the word compactness or first order logic or something like that in a paper of theirs. And then there are others, so people like Boris Silver, who is, has a very, very interesting back and forth kind of practice. So I think there are people who are want to join the functional analysis club or the algebraic geometry club, and that they see that being, you know, they're going to be able to do that if they eliminate meta-mathematics. Okay, and so they get very, you ask them why, and they don't want to talk about it, or they don't. And it can get pretty nasty, I can tell you, it can get pretty nasty. But somebody like Saffaroncello or Boris Silva, or what they do is they're trying to prove a semantic theorem. They notice that they're in, you know, they can regard themselves as working within a particular logic. That logic will have nice model theoretic properties. They use the property and then they get rid of the logic. So there is this sort of back and forth. I think Boris Silver, you know, he wants to, yeah, he has a very, so he says, if you think about physics, why would you have a Lowenheim-Skolem theorem in physics? What could that possibly look like? So he's a very interesting figure, but the model theorists are all different. I think right now we have this division between the classical model theorists coming from Mostovsky and then this Taine stability theory and so forth.
Thank you, Juliet, for your inspiring and liberating talk. I would like to ask you somewhat provocatively. It seems that your talk is strong based on model theory, on model theoretical results. It seems that you are, in some sense,
Such as?
Replacing syntactical or traditional, say, formalized formalization in mathematics and logic by model theory. It's only a provocative comment. So
Can I just say,
you know, but the way you did not mention so many perspectives from the computational point of view. It's the only question, what about it?
yeah, so and that's why I think also Marco mentioned model theory. There's very little model theory here. So I'm talking about model classes, which are classes of structure. Model classes of structures that are closed under isomorphism, period. There's no model theory, it says groups, class of all groups. Class of all vector spaces, class of all, anything you like. It's that's the fundamental object of study, and working directly with those structures is the sort of starting point. So I think when I say model classes, I'm not doing model theory. I mentioned model theoretic properties like compactness and Lowenheim's golem, Shalah's work on the abstract elementary classes and so on. But there's very little model theory there in what I'm doing, and I don't regard myself a model theorist. Maybe in the classical sense a long time ago, some papers I wrote a long time ago, but the computational point of view is very interesting because, as I said, I think there's computability resists falling under the knife of category theory. I mean, I've been looking at, because of the conversation with this student, I think Eilenberg wrote a book giving a categorical analysis of computation, other people. And it's sort of not very nice, and it hasn't really, I think there's a consensus out there that there is no definitive analysis of computability, definitive categorical analysis of computability. And I think that's because of the texture, that's because of this idea of a computation. So, the abstract logic approach or the outside approach of category theory, it just doesn't. So I think that's a very interesting case. Yeah, so I learned a lot of category theory as a student, but not since at all. So I'm going to go back and read it. But I think that's a question, that would be the sort of question in my wheelhouse. Why is there no definitive categorical analysis of computability out there? This idea of the exterior point of view just doesn't seem to get us very far.
Any other questions?
You have shown that many syntactic theory can have a model theoretical characterization. So for you, that's model theoretical include coding. Take the second completeness theorem, for example, those falls with the.
Sorry, say that again. Does semantic characterization include what?
So for you, that's model theoretical method including coding. Coding your arithmetic region to base theorem. Take the second completeness theorem, for example.
Second. Oh, yes.
Yeah, as far as we know, we're gonna have a totally coding free tool of the G2. So in this thing that what do you talk about formula needs and fair needs? That's not available for G2 in the current state.
Yeah, so I think it's related to a question that might seem unrelated, but I mean, you can ask these Fields medalists who win number theorists. You can ask Michael too. Why don't you have a Fields medal? You should. Why are they not running into in the work that they're doing, undecidability and incompleteness and so on. And you say, well, these incompleteness results depend on coding, but here's an observation for you. All these codings are recursive in each other. So yes, everything's very dependent on coding, but the codings are all recursive in each other. So there is a way of thinking about it as putting it all into one basket. I'm not asking the question again. So, I'm not sure that answers your question. So, but is coding a model theoretic, I don't know, it's as syntactic as it can get, right? If I understand it correctly.
Maybe a couple of very naive questions from my point of view. So first, when you manage to capture the different logical formulations by this unified model class approach, I'm trying to think how I would understand model classes, and being so far away from this, I would have to hold on to the syntax of working with model classes. Isn't it rather than a semantic kind of translation, translation to a privileged syntax? Is it really about semantics, or is it really about holding on to a syntax that we're really comfortable with?
So I would say no. I mean, the class of all groups, these are all groups. Groups have binary operations, so we have a common signature. A syntax is something that's built up recursively within a formalism. So,
But when
I mean,
talk
the
about
class
them,
of-
when I prove theorem about them,
yeah, well, you can think of, your theorem can be, involve quantification over first order logic. But the whole question of, you think of all groups, what's the right logic? Well, if you want nice model theoretic properties, you formalize it in first order logic. If you want infinitary quantification, you use your L capital. So I don't see syntax there at all. And I think that's the whole, that's a big part of what I'm doing right now is how do you extract a syntax from a model class? What is the right logic for the class of all groups? So maybe this is sort of what, and right meaning natural. Right, so I see syntax as something very, very different from vocabulary. Yeah.
and maybe another very naive question. It's a bit of a conspiracy theory question. Isn't it maybe because the reason why you can capture the variance of so many logics by this unified translation? Maybe it's because we got rid of all the bad logics along the way, maybe just like a sort of natural sociological selection of logics.
Well, I think there is natural selection. I think the model theorists, they like first order logic because of its model theoretic properties, compactness, Lonheim-Scullum. I mean, these are very important tools, and logics that don't have those. I mean, I got to know Paolo when I was doing models for arithmetic, so I'm very fond of these all results because it reminds me of you. But if you look at weak theories of arithmetic, right, you go very far down in the induction axiom, you weaken it very, very much. For example, the Shepardson theorem that there's a model of I open with a square root of 2, a rational square root of 2 in it, and so forth. So these are very, very interesting, and I think they should be studied. They will always be there. I think logicians will always, come up with logic. But I think in terms of model theoretic practice, there's a very strong natural selection going on there. In terms of set theory, set theorists, they have a resistance to extensions of first order logic. Even so, I think now this is crumbling a little. Yeah.
So thank you very much. Thank you. So see you all here tomorrow.
Great, sure. So you and I are sort of on the same page, I think.
Yeah, there's still something I don't understand because if I now have to start building one of the theorems, as someone who barely understands it or very got logic, the narrative of it. The first thing that I have to learn is the syntax of proving stuff about model structure. What kind of logic am I using? The formal structure am I using to reason about that? Thank you.
About three groups and all kinds of things.
I've been formalism free for all my career.
I mean, in addition, let's have all these theorems like reverse them. Okay, or let's take like a Humboldt theorem and reverse it and see what, you know, how strong. I think when you're doing that, right, you're not, you're not working in the loop.
I'm not
You know,
working in exactly.
well, we know, that's what we know, but they don't.
Okay.
Not knowing
He
it.
has to-
So actually, it's a kind of very careful, because we have the logic independent, we can translate it to say something that feels logically independent.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
I think I get it.
I suspicious of claim that there's something that you know that we don't know.
You're right. But did you like those quotes about, those quotes for you?
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Landsberg
thank you.
and all that stuff.
Yeah, but you know, it's difficult to know how to react because the syntax is irrelevant.
Yeah.
And the fact that people, you can say that the fact that people who are working in different areas of mathematics not communicate with one another. And when model theory was introduced into number theory about 30 years ago, it was introduced as another structure. It was introduced implicitly within the framework of or this way of thinking, categorical way of thinking. So there are some very difficult theorems that have been proved making use of Hohmann analysis. It's surprising. Well, in some sense, I think I don't know that anybody is. But the way it's described is, well, there's theorem about buyout rate. The transcendental implementation. And so that's that is when the subset is out rate. In both structures, something that's really rare. That's what open about is. In fact,
The slides are.
sorry.
You know how to find the slides?
No.
Okay. Extension to the room.
I have no idea. The guy should know is talking. No, he won't talk.
I want to see if they got here.
Sylvia, then.
She said it would look on here, but she just said it would look on here,
Okay.
but.
Maybe close the PDF. The top left, yeah. Okay.
You gave me some confidence. My 5 and 7. It tries to Michael, sometimes you don't make
You don't have my email. Okay, I'll tell you.
Yeah.
And it's you don't have to do this sort of. 283 there. I love the ABCD.
Yeah. That's I remember.
Maybe your university permits, you know, it's 5 minutes. Oh, then. Yeah, that's good. Okay. Then,
And then you see also the form and the address, when we start, it's like right here, when we are talking. That's just like median, that's easy. That's what we're working on. Yeah, and they have vegetarian solutions. Yeah. He's like.
Yeah, okay.
It was a long.
Right, yeah.
Great science. It's right here. Sorry? I don't think we're gonna pay the top and expensive. Yeah, no, I got this. Okay, see you later. When you get things failing, like
Oui, et non, c'est sûr que vu notre situation, necessarily
Yeah.
for example, on credit for
Exactly. But we can keep points on it. Some guys can speak in your seminar. Because close, I give it in 3 weeks, 300 companies.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, and then our meeting, now we're gonna. So I was thinking about asking a question. Oh, but I'm, okay,
We're not gonna go over these.
right now, I first want to drop this off in my room instead of dragging it around everywhere, and I want to splash them. I want to splash some water on well, we can meet in an hour. Are you gonna have a meeting?
Yeah.
But then there'll be, what kind of group you want and where?
Right there, and.
Oh, that looks like a
White
poplar.
line.
This is popular. I have, oh, I really have.
Yes, okay, good. Was it okay, Karina? It was okay, but I need a 2 hour expansion. You know, like 2 hour expansion. I didn't know.
Avec nous, on va aller prendre un coup. Hein? Tu es où?
Il est pas loin. Je sais pas encore.
Ah, t'as pas dit ça?
Si, je sais pas où il est.
Ah,
J'ai pas penché.
non, tu sais pas où c'est.
Non. C'est maintenant, il reste un truc, d'accord.